delighted you could join us today in what is a beautiful Isle of Man. Today is the third in our webinar series where we'll be talking to you about wealth management and the Isle of Man. I'm delighted to be joined by Rachel Lee and Steve Barrow from Standard Bank, Andy Halsall from Nedbank, and Anthony Kelsey from Capital International. So without any further ado, I'm delighted to introduce you to Rachel Lee from Standard Bank. Thank you.
So, good day to you all. I'm aware we're speaking to a predominantly African audience today, but can I please also extend a warm welcome to our global attendees. My name is Rachel Lee and I work for Standard Bank Isle of Man Limited, who've been based on the Isle of Man for almost 30 years. Myself personally, I came to the Isle of Man 25 years ago on what was meant to be a short secondment, and I loved the Isle of Man so much I was very proud to make it my home. Also proud to call the Isle of Man home for business are Standard Bank, and I'll provide you a short message from Peter Sliebush, who is our chairman.
Good day. My name is Peter Sliebush, and I'm the chairperson of Standard Bank Group's operations in the Isle of Man. We're exceptionally proud of our Isle of Man operations, and we've been there for some 28 years. We serve our African customers in terms of high net worth individual customers, corporate customers and trusts, as well as some rest of world clients in the Isle of Man. We've also recently extended our lease by some 10 years as a commitment to our operations in the Isle of Man. We've enjoyed an excellent working relationship with the regulators in the Isle of Man, and I must say, having sat on a number of boards in a number of countries, we've been incredibly impressed at how proactively and sensibly the Isle of Man regulator has helped us to navigate this COVID crisis that we've been through. I note that the Isle of Man has recently received an award for the Best International Financial Centre recently from the International Investment Awards. And we are very proud of what you've done, and well done on your award and the recognition as the Best International Financial Centre. Standard Bank Isle of Man has also received an award for the Best Private Client Experience in the Isle of Man, which we are exceptionally pleased with as well. The Isle of Man business serves as a great part of our client value proposition to our clients and is also very helpful in terms of generating offshore dollar liquidity for the group. We also have our Standard Bank Isle of Man branch for CIB that helps us to gather dollar liquidity there. I'd like to thank particularly our customers, our staff and the regulators who have helped us to build an incredible business there that we are immensely proud of. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
So where is the Isle of Man, you may ask yourself? Put quite simply, if you were to draw a line in between Liverpool and Dublin and make a mark at the halfway point, then that's where you'll find the Isle of Man and our 85,000 residents. So, the Isle of Man also has a deep-seated history with Africa, going back as far as the 1800s, where a lot of Manx miners actually migrated to South Africa to work in its deep mining industry. 40 years ago, Isle of Man began its financial services sector, and to this very day it contributes about 40% of our GDP. So, we operate a robust financial services industry here in the Isle of Man, and not that I want to give away any of our ages today, but between your three presenters you have over 100 years of relevant industry experience available to you. Let me also bust a myth today, and that myth is that all companies on the Isle of Man are brass plaque organisations. Let me speak about my own organisation, Standard Bank. Here on the island, we employ over 160 staff, so we're very much a real business, employing real people and a real company. So the Isle of Man, we're a crown dependency. What does that mean? It means we're not part of the UK, and it means we're not part of the EU. We also operate our own independent taxation and legal system, and we're also self-governing. What does that mean? Well, it means at the end of the year, our constitution doesn't allow us to borrow money to balance our books, and all of our strengths are very nicely presented in our Moody's rating of AA2. Now, one of the most popular questions that I get asked by our intermediaries and clients is how safe is my money when I bring it to the Isle of Man? And aside from talking about our own company's financial strengths, we talk also about the Isle of Man's Depositors Compensation Scheme. And the Depositors Compensation Scheme affords you £50,000 per individual, per institution, in terms of cover. Most notably as well, it's a tried and tested scheme, and the last time we enacted the Depositors Compensation Scheme was in 2009. We also offer tax neutrality on the Isle of Man, And that basically means that all companies here pay interest to its clients' gross. However, I will add the caveat that this doesn't mean you're absolved of any personal tax liability you may have in your own country of residence, and all businesses here will always recommend that you seek expert advice in this regard. So all three of the companies here were selected because whilst they operate a global business, we very much have an African presence, either through our heritage or our parentage. And that's very good for you because it means we understand Africa, we understand its cultures, and we understand its traditions. And what that means is if somebody was to call us from the African continent, then more than likely we're going to understand your circumstances and we're going to be able to work with you in order to work with your circumstances and onboard you as a client. As African businesses, we also have a risk appetite for doing business in the continent, and we're very adept at making sure we can work with the continent and also around our regulatory guidelines and boundaries. On to resilience, because that's the word that the Isle of Man is very synonymous with, and even our emblem stands for whichever way you throw us, we're going to stand on our feet. And I think the COVID period was a great example of how the Isle of Man displayed its resilience and its agility. All of the businesses were able to adapt and bring its technologies to the fore so we could send our workforces home and lock down. The whole island, in fact, brought themselves together in lockdown, and we were successful in eradicating COVID from our community. And actually, that's an achievement to this very day, over 120 days later, that we're still able to maintain, and we're very proud of. So at this point in time, please can I introduce you to one of my colleagues, Stephen Barrow, who's a G10 specialist for Standard Bank based in our London offices, and he's going to give you a brief economic overview. Thank you.
Okay, there's three aspects that I want to talk about today. One is the economic outlook, the second is the outlook for interest rates, and the third is the outlook for exchange rates, and particularly the dollar. As far as the global economy is concerned, as we know, this year is going to be a difficult year. Growth, I think, is going to decline by around 5%. It will rebound next year, probably by slightly less than 5%. The forecasts that we have are generally a little bit more pessimistic, I would say, than the consensus. The IMF, for instance, recently suggested that growth this year would decline by around 4.4%. So we think down 5%. If we look at the first slide here, we can see in the case of the US how growth has developed going back quite some years. And we can see on this line the drop in growth in the US, or the drop in GDP in the US when we had the financial crisis, which was a big move down in 2008. And of course, we can see now the huge drop that we've seen as a result of coronavirus. Now, I've used the case of the US here, but in actual fact, we could really impose any significant economy on this chart and it would pretty much look the same. China may be one that looks slightly different, but for most developed countries, they're going to look the same sort of shape as this. The dotted line on the right-hand side of this chart shows what I expect will happen with growth going forward. So we'll see a significant rebound in growth in the third quarter of this year, but then things tend to meander along thereafter. It's not as if this is a full-fledged V-shaped recovery in the US or indeed in the global economy, because I think what will happen is that the growth rate, whilst it will pick up, will then quickly slow back down again. And certainly a double-dip recession is not impossible. If you look at the slope of this line, which I've superimposed with the black dotted lines, you can see the trend from before the financial crisis. You can see a trend that we've seen since the financial crisis, and I've imposed on this chart an indicator of the sort of trending growth that we might anticipate in the future. And the thing to notice about these three lines, these three straight lines, is that their slope is falling away. It's becoming shallower. The growth rate is declining. And the key point here is that the economic scarring from the coronavirus is going to be substantial. It's going to be substantial because governments and the private sector will have to work off significant amounts of debt. Consumers will want to hold more precautionary savings. As a result of the coronavirus, firms will be more reticent to invest in case the virus comes back or another one replaces it in the future. So I think the good news is that the global economy will bounce back. The bad news, in a sense, is that the growth rate in the future is going to be slower than we've experienced in the past. Now, that might make for perhaps a difficult investment climate, because obviously if growth is relatively lackluster, then maybe financial assets won't perform very well, such as stock markets, for instance. However, you could say that's exactly what we have seen for many years since the global financial crisis. Global economies have recovered relatively slowly, yet financial asset prices have increased really quite substantially. If we look at the next slide, for instance, you'll see from that maybe a large part of the reason for a decent performance, maybe even a good performance in financial assets, has been that interest rates have been held at very low levels. So rather than investing in the economy, as it were, we've seen investment tending to go into financial assets like stocks. The key going forward from here is whether these interest rates stay low for a very long period of time, because if they do, that again may help push more savings into financial assets such as stocks or other riskier investments. And indeed, if you look at what the market is assuming for interest rates going forward, they assume that interest rates will stay very low for many, many years. This chart shows the overnight interest swap market, and basically, in very simple terms, this just tells us what the market is thinking about interest rates in three major areas, the UK, the US, and the Eurozone, over the next number of years. And you can see from this that the markets are not really expecting policy rates like the base rate or the Fed funds rate in the US to rise for something like 4 to 5 years. Is that a reasonable assumption? Well, I think it is. Does that necessarily mean that the outlook for equity markets, for instance, is good because interest rates will stay very low and a lot of investors will have to go into the stock market to try and earn some returns? I do think that equities probably will move ahead over time, but I think there are, at the same time, some limits to that. One issue, of course, is that whilst these interest rates are low, difficult for them to go a great deal lower, should that be required. Governments as well have tried to help the global economy by cutting taxes or more likely increasing spending. But the governments are racking up huge debts as a result, and their ability to do a great deal more is becoming more limited. So I do think that there are undoubted headwinds. So even though the low interest rates are providing a good environment in some senses for risky assets like stocks or corporate credit, for instance, there are still dangers ahead as a result of these impediments that I just mentioned. I do think overall the returns from equities will be positive going forward, but they might not be as positive as we've seen in the past. And I think that means that investors, in some senses, if they want to get returns from financial assets like stocks, like bonds, may have to use the currency market a little bit more. And I think perhaps fortunately the currency market will be of benefit in this regard. And that's because I think that what we can expect is for the dollar to decline for probably a good number of years. This next chart shows in the orange line, the movements of the dollar against other major currencies. We call it the SDR, the special drawing right. It doesn't really matter exactly what index we're using here. It's just a measure of the dollar against other major currencies like the euro and the yen and sterling and the Chinese renminbi. And that chart shows that the dollar has been rising for about a decade or so. And that's quite a long cycle for the dollar. I think it's unlikely that the dollar can continue to rise for significantly longer. Generally, the cycles in the dollar don't last much more than a decade. And I think there are good reasons for it to fall in the long term. Main reason is that the US is building up considerable debts as a result of the coronavirus crisis on the fiscal side. So its savings levels, its net saving levels are going down. That's the grey line on this chart, and you can see the very substantial fall that we've seen just recently, and that's largely reflecting the build-up of a huge budget deficit in the US, going from about $1 trillion last year to closer to $3 trillion this year. All countries, of course, are seeing budget deficits increase. The problem for the US is that it needs to attract capital from overseas to fund those deficits. And with interest rates in the US very low, I do think that it will find that difficult over time. And as a result, our forecasts are for euro-dollar, for instance, to rise to 130 to 140 over the next few years. Sterling dollar, for instance, to rise up to something like 140, 150. So that's the views on currencies, and I've spoken about interest rates staying low, and I've spoken about the economic environment. What's the overall conclusions? I think, broadly speaking, I would look for equity markets to improve and probably be a better bet than bond markets. I haven't spoken much about inflation, but I do think that inflation might be more of an issue going forward than it perhaps has been in the wake of the global financial crisis. So from an investor perspective, holding some index-linked bonds, for instance, may be something to think about. As I mentioned as well, I think currencies offer scope for enhanced gains. I think that investors that use the prospects of a weaker dollar and buy overseas assets on an unhedged basis out of dollars are probably going to be better rewarded than those that hedge their currency exposures. I haven't really spoken specifically about emerging markets, but I do think that given valuation levels, that emerging markets are on a longer term basis more attractive than developed markets. And within the developed markets, I think the regions that I would focus more on, and indeed in emerging markets as well, the regions that I would focus on more would be Asia and Europe, and probably less so the US, where valuations are quite high, certainly in the equity market. And as I've explained, we're looking for the dollar to decline. So overall, quite a mixed picture. I think equities will outperform bonds. And I do think, as I said, that investors should use the currency and the prospects of a weaker dollar to try and enhance their returns going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for that enlightenment. And now I'm delighted to introduce you to one of my local colleagues, Andrew Housel, here from Nedbank Private Wealth on the Isle of Man, and he's going to take the subject content into a little bit more detail for you.
With the impact of COVID-19 affecting people right across the world, finances, in particular, can be impacted in so many ways. I want to go through some of the important factors clients should consider when looking at the banking environment on the Isle of Man. For our clients, two of the biggest factors are stability and security. With an unstable economic and political environment, clients are looking for an element of assurance. They want to know that there will be fewer, or preferably no, more nasty surprises. Whilst there can never be 100% assurance, as Rachel covered earlier, the Isle of Man is a stable political and economic location. The island's banks now hold deposits in excess of £35 billion, around 700 billion rands. It is also worth considering the opportunity. Clients are looking for as many options as possible for their wealth. A full range of banking services is available. Building on its reputation and expertise, the island's banking sector offers all the service that private, corporate and institutional clients may need. These include retail, commercial, private banking, expatriate and international banking, deposits, treasury services, foreign exchange, residential mortgages, investment property finance and corporate finance. Property investment seems to be a recurring theme in my discussions with South African clients. There are a number of ways to access property. You can buy property outright, take a bond against a property, or you can borrow against a portfolio to fund the property purchase. If bricks and mortar isn't your thing, you can invest in property trusts, which are traded on stock markets. Regardless of the solution you're looking to achieve, there are banking providers on the Isle of Man that can satisfy all of these options. But clients are also looking for someone to guide them in navigating the sea of opportunities available in global financial markets. With a provider based in the Isle of Man that understands the global landscape, as well as the needs of South Africans looking to diversify internationally, there are many great opportunities to explore with regards to your wealth. This is an area I will return to later on. Clients are also looking for convenience and, as well as a friendly time zone, the Isle of Man offers a track record of working with many South African institutions. By way of example, Nedbank Private Wealth has been here since 1987, and our clients can choose to have their international finances managed through their South African relationship manager if they are also a client of Nedbank Private Wealth in South Africa. Ultimately, when considering a banking environment for your hard-earned wealth, you need an environment that is stable and secure. You want to receive all of the banking facilities you're familiar with. You need to be able to communicate using the latest secure means, and you want to be able to do it at a time that's convenient for you. The Isle of Man provides this environment, and in addition to other providers, there are a number of familiar names in established South African banks on the Isle of Man to choose from. Thank you. I will now hand over to Anthony Kelsey from Capital International.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I work at Capital International and I'm the Group Commercial Director, so my role is to head up our business development and marketing activities. But I also, until very recently, sat on the board of our South African businesses, and so it's a great pleasure to be talking to you today about South Africa and the connectivity with the Isle of Man, as it's something that's close to my own heart. So when clients in South Africa are looking to maybe invest internationally and look to move some of their rand outside of the country for diversification, it can often be quite a daunting process. You know, sending their hard-earned cash halfway around the world to a jurisdiction that they may not even have heard of or probably certainly have never visited is something that obviously they need to think very carefully about. And we and the colleagues that you're listening to today are all very conscious of that, and that's why we as businesses have operations both here in the Isle of Man and also down in South Africa, because it's through that local presence and connectivity between the two jurisdictions that we can offer some of that support and comfort to clients when they're considering where they place their wealth. It's also important for advisors to understand that, so that when they're talking to their clients, they can have confidence in what they're saying. So we've all got used to meeting online and doing Teams calls during these COVID times, but there's nothing that replaces the face-to-face of local presence in a jurisdiction where the client actually lives. And so we found that meeting with clients in our offices in Johannesburg and Cape Town gives them that little bit of impetus they need to make a decision that feels like quite a major decision when considering offshore. So with a local presence, companies are also obviously submitting to local regulation as well, and that gives our clients comfort that their regulator in their home jurisdiction is regulating what we do and making sure that we treat the clients that we're dealing with in South Africa in an appropriate and responsible way. So for clients who've made that decision to move their monies offshore, what next? It's not simply a case of ringing up their local bank and then getting monies wired to a far-flung jurisdiction. There's actually a process that needs to be gone through, and that's clearly set out in South African regulation. So the South African Reserve Bank legislates for an annual exchange allowance that can be used to move monies from rand into a hard currency and then moved internationally to a jurisdiction of choice. So it's really important that clients understand that there's a process to be followed, there's obviously documentation that needs to be completed, and that again lends itself to having someone locally who knows that process, who can sit with clients and who can explain what is required, so that when they're making that decision to move their money, they follow the process efficiently and in a clear fashion. So let's assume the clients have made those steps and they've gone through that process and the money lands here in the Isle of Man. What then does a client need to do in order to invest? Well, again, here choice can be a little overwhelming. So clients have gone from a investment universe, if you like, that's very locally focused in rand, where there's a limited choice of collective investment schemes. There's obviously the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, but beyond that, it then becomes a bit more tricky. Now that the money's landed in the Isle of Man, the whole world has now opened up to them in terms of international opportunity. So no longer do they need to stay in rand. The whole point of diversification is moving to a harder currency. But which currency do they choose, or which currencies? And then where do they invest their money around the world? You've suddenly got global stock exchanges, you've got offshore funds, domestic funds, you've got structured products, a whole range of different things. So for clients who are looking to implement their strategy, they'll often then seek some expert advice. They'll either appoint an investment advisor or potentially a discretionary fund manager. And it's really important that at that point they seek out individuals or firms that have the relevant qualifications and the relevant experience. And clearly you're hearing from some of those companies here today, and there's plenty others in the Isle of Man. But you'll also find South African companies that have made a niche in focusing on international investment strategies. So whoever the client chooses, it's really important that they then select a custody, bank or an investment platform which allows them to work with their advisor that they've chosen or their discretionary manager. It's also important to understand what opportunities that custody platform or bank offers in terms of those international investments. There's no point in selecting somewhere that restricts things to a very limited range or potentially their own in-house solutions when you've got the world of investment opportunity at your feet. So we prefer the term open architecture in terms of the platform that we offer. That means that clients can trade assets on stock exchanges around the world in all those currencies and all the different asset types that I outlined. And you've got things like exchange-traded funds, which are very much flavour of the moment. Also structured products from third-party banks or other providers are also popular as low-risk solutions for clients, particularly in these kind of COVID times where there's lots of uncertainty. So, as well as investment options, it's important to make sure that you have the right product types or structures that South African investors also traditionally have liked. So we see, for example, a lot of clients seeking out trusts or corporate vehicles, increasingly international pensions, and also then you've got South African endowment life wrappers, which are something that high net worth and affluent investors particularly like as well. So with your custody platform, you need to be able to access all of those things in one place, because that then simplifies the client's experience, consolidates the reporting, and makes it very easy for them to log in online and see how their international investment portfolio is performing, rather than having to go to multiple different product providers and multiple different websites. And that leads very much onto the digital and technological strength that the Isle of Man has, because we can build our proposition off the back of great infrastructure that we have as a jurisdiction in the Isle of Man. We can tap into skilled resources that are here so that all the companies can deliver really excellent online experience and digital services for our South African client base, ensuring that they feel comfortable that their international investments are safe and feel comfortable that they're doing exactly what it is that the strategy that they've employed. So that's all I wanted to cover off today. It's very much about local support, having a range of investment opportunities and leveraging off a really great digital experience.
Just like to say a big thank you to Slibus and to Stephen for their contributions today, and of course to our panellists for everything that you've been telling us this morning. Probably the first question I'd like to ask is, in the talks that you've been given, there was a big emphasis on the connectivity between the Isle of Man and South Africa. Perhaps you could just elaborate a little bit more about why that's really important for your clients. Anthony, maybe you could...
Yeah, I'd be delighted. So for us, putting offices down in South Africa was a really big step for us to become more front-footed with our clients down in South Africa. Local support, which I've talked about, is something that they really value, and so the connectivity between head office in the Isle of Man and our local offices in Johannesburg and Cape Town is something that's happening on a daily basis. We're all used to using Teams now because of COVID, but we were already using Teams on a daily basis throughout our organisation, and it just helps the two offices be really connected and joined up when they're dealing with clients down there.
Thanks very much for that, Anthony. That was really interesting. Rachel, I think you've got some points there as well.
Yeah, so a little bit different to Anthony. Our parent company is actually based in Johannesburg. That's where head office is. But we also operate in a lot of sub-Saharan countries throughout Africa. So Africa really is our home. So we do quite a lot to make sure that we educate our staff on the Isle of Man to the cultures and traditions of Africa. And we actually have a lot of our team travelling backwards and forwards into the African continent, so they can really try and understand the business. And even myself, I've been quite fortunate to visit a few African countries in the line of my work, and there's nothing like touching, feeling the business. So we're very heavily invested in making sure that that connectivity is there and that we've got that understanding and empathy with our clients.
Super, that's very good. Andy,
Yeah.
I think you're slightly different as well, aren't you?
We have a slightly different structure. So we are a wholly owned subsidiary of the South African parent. So we have lots of clients based in South Africa. So it's vitally important that we've been able to keep open all the communication channels throughout the last year, especially as everything's hit home.
Super, thank you very much. So probably leading on from that is, in your experience, the clients from South Africa, what are their major concerns at the moment, and what are the things that we can really help them with? And maybe we'll start with Rachel this time.
Yeah. So I think one of the great positives is, for my company, for Andy's and Anthony's, we're a brand that everybody knows within their environment, so they love and trust the brand that they're working with. But in seeing the Isle of Man, they're actually seeing us as a safe repository for their funds and investments. So I think that's one of the key things that excites the South Africans in terms of finding diversification and safety for their funds.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Andy, your thoughts?
I think South African clients have always been fairly aware of the need and desire to diversify their holdings. So they've always been very aware of diversification by geography and diversifying by asset class. And this is a very important thing for them, particularly at this time.
That's a really, really good point. And Anthony, I'm sure you've got something to add on to that as well.
Yes, I think, and it's not just for South Africa, but security and safety is obviously paramount when everything is sort of unsettled in the world at the moment. But I think it's also knowing that the area that they're dealing with is somewhere that is familiar with their culture, which Rachel alluded before, with their country and what's going on. It's one thing looking for a stable and secure jurisdiction, but knowing that you've got organisations there that understand where they're coming from, understand some of the local issues that maybe present themselves in South Africa, and can then react and deliver services in a way that meets their needs while they're down in South Africa there.
And again, we come back to some really good connectivity between the two jurisdictions. Leading on from that, we've talked a lot about diversification, and I heard it in some of the presentations, is what are the things that maybe people should be thinking about in terms of if they do want to diversify away from the rand?
Well, that's a great question. I think one of the things I talked about in my little talk was that when South Africans start investing internationally and looking to move their cash into a different environment that gives them that diversification, it can become a little bit like a rabbit in the headlights, because you've got local opportunities which are very obviously rand focused by their nature, and you've got a limited pool of investments, if you like, as an investment choice. And you move internationally and suddenly literally the world is your oyster, and how on earth do you navigate your way through that? So for our experience with clients is that getting proper advice, getting proper investment management expertise, where an organisation or an individual has real experience at managing international strategies, gives them the comfort that when they've moved some of their wealth internationally to get that diversity, that it's in safe hands and it's being well managed.
So I've had one last question for each of you, which is to just briefly tell us what makes the Isle of Man special for you personally.
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I'm not originally from the Isle of Man. My wife's from here and her family's been here for generations, so I've been here over 20 years. And the thing for me is the ability to have a great career working for, great organisation, but in an environment that allows me a great deal more flexibility than I'd have if I was working in the middle of London, a much greater work-life balance, but still have the ability to travel and go to other places such as South Africa.
So for me, like you, I'm not indigenous to the island, and I think it's amazing. I live on a place where the locals are actually in the minority, but the diversification is absolutely amazing. Isle of Man has offered me I think, more opportunities than I would have had if I stayed in my home city. But I'm proud to be Manx. Andy, I know he's a Manx person, but I feel Manx, and definitely when I talk to clients or intermediaries, people think, have you got a sideline job working for the Manx Tourist Board or something, because you talk about it with such passion. But it's that sense of pride that we're allowed to live here, live a wonderful life, but work hard as well at the same time.
I'd just add to that, it's infectious. I'm not Indigenous either. I came here on secondment 12 years ago, and stayed.
Yeah.
And Andy?
Well, I am a proud Manxman, and I'm pleased that you all enjoy the island as I do. It's certainly a sense of community. From a security point of view, with a young family, it's a great place to base yourself. So I'm pleased with the opportunities it provides everybody. It's a dynamic place.
That's a very good way of describing it. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Anthony, big thank you to Rachel, a big thank you to Andy, and I'd just like to say a big thank you to Capital International, to Standard Bank and to Nedbank for making me personally welcome when I visited South Africa last year. I hope you're all safe and well, and I will look forward to when I can come down and see you again soon, I hope. So thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us on the third of our webcast broadcasts. We've covered so far and why the choice of jurisdiction has never been so important. We've talked about asset structuring and protecting your legacy of the future. And in this series, we've been talking about asset protection and wealth management. Delighted to be joined by Rachel again and by Anthony. And we've got a few questions that have already been submitted during the course of the broadcast. So I'm going to take the first one, which is, are there any local immigration specialists that can help me with a move to the Isle of Man? Absolutely, there are plenty available. We have several that we work very, very closely with. So if you'd like to drop us a message in through the email contact address, I'll be delighted to put you in touch with some. So the next question is quite an easy one. We'll probably turn to Anthony first, which is, what makes the Isle of Man stand out as an offshore jurisdiction of choice?
Thanks, John. It's a good question, and one that I think there's a whole list of different things that you can probably cite, but ones that stand out particularly for me is around stability and a track record in operating in the kind of offshore space. So that gives clients comfort that the jurisdiction they're dealing with knows what it's doing, has proven that they've been able to do it for a long time, and therefore, that gives them the comfort for their actual where they put their wealth.
Super. Rachel, anything to add?
Yeah, I'd add to that. I think we've touched on it during the webinar so far, the regulatory aspect. I think people can come to us with peace of mind, knowing that somebody's overseeing and governing what we're actually doing as an island. I think the experience that we have in terms of our financial services industry in general, and I guess also the element of teamwork on the island. So it's quite unique for offshore jurisdictions for us all to be working around the table today together. In some jurisdictions you might find actually that's not the way or the approach. So it's really quite a friendly and open door place to do business, and it's quite good that I can say if a client will come to me and ask and I can't place their business, I actually know through our teamwork a person that can. So yeah.
I think the other thing, sorry John, just to pick up on that, is also the level of customer service. So because we're experienced and have that track record, and as you say, we work very well together, that delivers a really good service back to clients in South Africa so they can feel comfortable that their wealth's secure.
Delighted to see a question in from my good friend Stuart James in Cape Town. I hope you're all well down there. And the first question is, any tips in terms of opening a personal or business bank account in the Isle of Man for South Africans? I couldn't have two better people to answer that question.
I can answer it from the banking point and aspect. So
Yeah, I mean, our doors are open for business and personal clients. Every business here on the island has its criteria and acceptability levels. So it really is a case of get in touch, talk to us about what your proposals and what your aspirations are. I think we're very quick to advise if something is completely outside of our comfort zone, if we can't do it, and then suggest somewhere that may be able to help if we can't actually place it. But yes, we definitely have the African appetite, as it were. So a big tick for that. Get in touch with us, talk to us, and we'll take it from there. Thanks, Stuart, for the question.
And Anthony, of course, you're shortly going to have a bank within the group yourselves.
Yes, we are, and we already deal very heavily on the investment side of the business with South African clients. Mauritian structures is something that often comes to us as well. But from a bank point of view, it's very much we are open for business, or we will be open for business next year. And it's really a case of treating every individual applicant on their own merits and looking through the basis of their proposal, understanding what they're trying to do, and if there are any things that we perhaps don't like the look of. But it's not a case of we have a blanket approach that says we will deal with these people and we won't deal with those people. It's very much on a case-by-case basis on the merits of that application.
And the second part of Stuart's question there is about, could a South African purchase UK property and obtain a mortgage via the Isle of Man for the purchase of that property?
Absolutely, it's a core part of our business, Stuart, here at Standard Bank, and I know with a lot of the other African flavoured banks here on the island, assisting clients to buy investment properties in the UK, particularly in this current period when the UK is seen as a good value in terms of property. So absolutely yes, all subject to application and on a case-by-case basis, but yes, we can help.
Of course. That probably leads on to another question that was submitted that says, can I have my deposits and assets managed through the Isle of Man, even though I may live in Joburg or Cape Town?
Yes, absolutely. In our experience, all of our South African clients, or pretty much all of them, will appoint either an advisor or a manager to help them with the strategy and implementation thereof, using an investment platform. It's quite rare to find a client who'll actually want to make investment choices themselves. It's perfectly possible, it just doesn't happen very often. And so it's up to clients to work with us to find an advisor that they feel comfortable with, and that could be someone in South Africa, it could be someone in the Isle of Man. It's really down to client choice.
Yep.
Totally. Yeah.
Hi, Devan. Really nice to hear from you, and I hope everything's well with you. Great that you think that the Isle of Man looks a beautiful place to live and work. You've asked the question about, is the cost of doing business in the Isle of Man expensive? I think that's obviously very difficult to call in terms of what your comparatives are, but generally the Isle of Man is a highly competitive place to do business. We have significant space here, and we kind of work out that we're about 30% lower operating costs than comparative jurisdictions, given the fact that we have a lot of space and the cost of property is probably lower, rentals lower. So yeah, we do believe that we're a very cost-effective alternative to other jurisdictions. But Devan, I'd love to hear from you if you'd like to drop me a message via the Finance IM website. I'd like to catch up with you anyway, so it'd be good to hear from you. Anything that you've got kind of thoughts and things that we've discussed over the last couple of hours that you'd like to expand on?
I think just picking up that cost piece and the mortgages. Obviously, for South African investors, they're used to South African interest rates. And obviously, in more established currencies, interest rate environment is very, very low. And so actually, the cost of borrowing, if you put it like that, if you're getting a mortgage or borrowing from the Isle of Man, is going to be a lot cheaper than it would be in South Africa. And a lot of South Africans we tend to see are sending their children to UK universities or other universities abroad. And then suddenly you think, well, where are they going to stay? Maybe I could buy a property, and if I can get some borrowing in a better currency, then that becomes quite an interesting proposition.
That's a really interesting point. Anything?
I think on the cost element as well, it's a lot of people think that maybe you have to travel to the island to do business and you have to meet in person. And I think all of us would say our doors are open. We'd be delighted to give you a tour and show you our beautiful place that we call home. But actually our ability to deal remotely is really at the fore with the digital capabilities of all of the organisations here. So from a cost basis, certainly you don't have to factor in the cost of travelling to the island in order to do business, and we can deal you remotely. Absolutely, yeah.
And there's a question in there from Stuart in terms of what sort of loan to value is the general risk appetite. That's a very, very broad question, which I'm going to pass swiftly on to Ray.
So I can only talk for Standard Bank, Stuart, here, but generally speaking, our maximum loan to value for UK residential properties would be 65% loan to value. But once again, it is always worth talking to us directly so we can understand what your needs and requirements are. Good question.
It is a good question, and of course there could be Lombard lending involved in that in terms of what other assets are available and that sort of facility available.
So great question. It's something that we'll be rolling out within our new banking proposition next year, so that anyone who has an investment portfolio managed on our platform can then apply for lending secured against that. Not too sure at the moment what those loan to value rates will be, but that's all to come.
So I think the answer from the team here, Stuart, is that it's kind of a more holistic position for what are the assets of the individual, what else may be available. It could be possible to 100% LTV if there are other assets available to secure a proportion, be it an investment portfolio or the like. I hope that answers the question. If not, please give us a shout and we'll help more. So in general, how have we found the conversations and that we've talked about in the last few weeks, the connectivity piece? How important is that going forward for us?
For me, I think it's vitally important because we operate in a competitive environment. There's many offshore jurisdictions of choice that the listeners here today get to choose from. And what we've got to do as an island is work together to make sure we put forward a united front. So we have all the good areas of regulation, etc., that government put into place. And now I think it's up to business to make sure we continue to work together and put on the pitch what we can do and what we can deliver. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also, there's obviously just the three of us here today, but there's, a whole raft of people out there in industry, many of whom are South Africans, so they have real first-hand experience of doing business in South Africa, and then for whatever reason they may be here temporarily or for other reasons. So there's a real network of professional services companies, not just investment providers or banks, but lawyers and accountants and so forth. So it really does give clients down in South Africa a kind of one-stop sense of professionalism and knowledge about their affairs.
That's super. I'm going to say thank you very much to Rachel for joining us this morning. Thank you to Anthony.
Thank you.
I hope that over the three broadcasts that we brought to you recently, that you can see that the Isle of Man should be the natural choice of jurisdiction for you. And everything that we've talked about in terms of the banking, the asset management, the structuring, the legacy protection have been of interest to you. I trust everybody's safe and well. We'll be bringing you a fourth in this series shortly, which will be focusing on living and working in the Isle of Man. It will be brought to you by our Locate team, and we'll bring you details of that shortly. So thank you so much again. I hope you're all well and stay safe.